Oh,
All
good
right.
Oh, good
evening, Erin.
evening, Erin.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
joining
much for
us.
joining us.
My name's
My
Miriam
name's
Of course.
Miriam
and
and Sarah,
and
and
I think
I
we've
think
just
we've
been
just
blown
been
away
blown
by this
away by
film.
this film.
There's a
There's
small
a
group of
small
us
group
here
of us
watching it
here watching
live,
it live,
and then there's
and
many,
then
many
there's
more
many,
people
many more
watching it
people
on
watching
our
it on
public
our public
television channel
television channel
191.
191.
Just to give you a
Just to
moment
give
of
you a moment of
background,
background,
so in
so in
April, after
April, after
2.5
two
months
and a
of
half
work
months of
here in
work here in
Easthampton,
Easthampton,
uh,
uh,
we passed a
we passed a
ceasefire
ceasefire
resolution for
resolution for
Gaza
Gaza
with
with
community
community
participation, a large
participation, a
group
large group
of
of
people of all
people of all
backgrounds,
backgrounds,
and
ages,
faiths,
and faiths,
actually.
actually.
And we passed
And we
the
passed the
resolution
resolution
7-0,
7 to
as the
0,
only
as the only
opposition
opposition
chose
chose not
not
to
to vote,
vote,
either abstained or
either abstained or
didn't appear.
didn't appear.
And so
And
what we
so
felt
what we
strongly
felt
about
strongly about
was that it was
was that it was
important to
important to
ensure
ensure
that we didn't
that
just
we
pass
didn't
a
just pass a
resolution,
resolution,
but that we
but
did
that we
outreach
did
and
outreach and
education in the
education in the
community
community
to ensure
to
that
ensure
people
that
could,
people could,
our community
our
could
community could
understand the
understand
issues
the
and the
issues
people
and the people
involved.
involved.
We have a
We
weekly
have a
standout
weekly
on
standout
Tuesday
on Tuesday
afternoons
afternoons
in the middle of our
in the middle of our
calling for a
downtown, calling for a
ceasefire.
ceasefire.
And then this is
And
the
then this
third
is
of
the
4
third of
movies
4
that we're
movies that
showing
we're
for the
showing
moment.
for the moment.
And then
And
we're
then we are
having
having
the play
the play
Palestine by Nashla
Palestine by
Saeed
Nashla Saeed
about growing up
about growing up
Palestinian Arab
Palestinian
American
Arab American
on August
on August
17th
17th
here
here
in our
in our
public
public
venue, city
venue,
space.
city space.
So we urge
So we
everybody
urge
listening
everybody
in
listening in
to
to
see that
see
play
that
and
play
to go on
and
the
to
City
go on the
Space
City Space
website where they can
website
get
where they can
tickets,
get tickets,
and also to
and also
continue
to
to
continue
join
to
us for
join us
movies
for movies
and
and
discussions.
discussions.
Next week,
Next
the
week,
film will
the
be
film will
The
be
Night Won't
The Night
End.
Won't End.
And leading that
And leading that
discussion
discussion
will be Nancy Mansour, who's the director of
Eyewitness
Eyewitness
Palestine
Palestine
and
and
Existence is
Resistance, who
Resistance,
just a few
who
months
just a
ago
few months
took
ago
a
took a
humanitarian and
humanitarian and medical
medical delegation
delegation
to
to
Rafah.
Rafah.
So,
So,
Erin,
Erin,
we want this to
we
be
want this
about
to
you
be
in the
about you
film
in the
now.
film
I just
now.
had to
I
give
just
that
had to give that.
introduction. So, if you could please say a
Of
few
course,
words
and thank you so
about the
much,
film,
for all you're doing, calling for a ceasefire,
and
passing
then
a ceasefire resolution, and then trying to educate your community as much as you can. I'm a Massachusetts resident. I live in Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm sorry I can't be there right now, but I've been here. I grew up in Maine originally, but I've been in Somerville and the Boston area for about 8 years now. So it's always wonderful to do screenings in Massachusetts. And I'm here to answer any questions you have about myself, about how we made the film, our goals for the film, how it's been received, whatever you'd like. And thank you so much again for letting me be here and for showing my film.
So I'll start with the initial question, and then I'll come around with the microphone and have other people ask you questions. And feel free to interject with anything you want.
I think everyone's muted. I'm not sure I can hear. If someone's talking, I think everyone else is muted right now.
Well, I will be passing the microphone to them. I have the microphone, and I will be passing it to them. I don't know if you can see me. Am I now in your view? Oh. So here I am.
Yeah, I can't hear you right now.
Wrong
Sorry.
side.
Whoever is running the Zoom, if you can unmute on the Zoom, all the other pages are muted right now. So the person who is in control of the Zoom, if they can just unmute their page, that would be great. Okay, this should work now.
So this may
mean that you didn't hear what I said, but I won't repeat it.
We'll go on with
the question.
And we're very
And
glad,
you're here. We're terrifically glad you're here. And I'll ask the first question. And then I'll pass the microphone around to the people who are in the physical audience. Unfortunately, those who are watching virtually don't have a way to ask questions, which we regret. So my first question is, how did you come to make this film? What's the background to your decision to make it, and how did you go about it?
Yeah, great question. So this film is very roughly based off my own story and is even more closely based off the story of many of my closest friends and relatives. My upbringing was not exactly the same as the two protagonists in the film, especially Simone, but it was similar. I did not go to Jewish day school, but I went to Hebrew school growing up. I grew up actually in a pretty small Jewish community in rural Maine. And my parents were kind of back to the land hippie types who grew up in Maine or who moved to Maine. And so that's where I grew up. Our synagogue was about 20 miles away. Yeah, the our synagogue was about 20 miles away. And really growing up, it was very difficult to formulate a positive Jewish identity. I think learning about the Holocaust, learning about the millennia of oppression the Jewish people have faced was very difficult for me as a young kid. And it's very difficult, I think, for many young people to know what to do with that information, to learn that your people have been oppressed so violently and so horrifically throughout time, especially by Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans. And so when I really began learning about Israel as a young person, especially around my bat mitzvah age, it was incredibly empowering. How the story of Israel, especially the founding of Israel, was told to me initially, like it's told to many of the folks in the film, Israel is the light at the end of the tunnel. After millennia and millennia of oppression, Israel is finally the place that the Jewish people have created their own country. They've gone back to their historic homeland, and they have created a strong state that can defend the Jewish people at all costs. And obviously, how it was told to us, that strength was needed after the horrors of the Holocaust. And so that narrative of Israel really being a place of redemption and a place for Jewish people to find safety was incredibly empowering and made a lot of sense to me as a young person who had learned of stereotypes of Jews being weak and being unable to defend ourselves and unable to fight against the genocide that Jewish people faced in the Holocaust. And so, especially after my bat mitzvah, when I was given a number of kind of pro-Israel novels, that narrative really began to speak to me in a pretty profound way. And like many of the characters in the film, Israel really became my Jewish identity. Though I had gone to Hebrew school and had a bat mitzvah, etc., it was the modern story of Israel that really made me feel proud to be a Jewish person and really connected me to the larger Jewish community. And so I began wearing a Star of David around my neck in my tiny little rural high school and a public high school in rural Maine, and I actually considered joining the Israeli military. I'm very lucky that I did not, but it was something that I very seriously considered. And then my senior year of high school, before I could join the Israeli military, very luckily, my public high school had an independent study where you could study whatever you wanted the entire year. And I was going to study the history of Israel. I had this amazing teacher who ran the class who I'd had classes with before, and I was so excited to learn about Israel and just study all I could that year. And he knew my family and I were very progressive. He'd had me in many other classes, had my brother, and he was kind of just shocked by how deeply pro-Israel I was and how it really was my Jewish identity. And he asked me a question early on in that year, which changed my life. He just said, do you know anything about Palestinian history? And he didn't ask me he wasn't aggressive. He wasn't attacking me. He was just wondering if I knew anything about the Palestinian people. And I really trusted this teacher. I loved him. He was a mentor of mine. I knew he wasn't trying to attack me. And so I really began thinking about it. And I came to realize that I didn't really know anything about the Palestinian people or Palestinian history. The traditional pro-Israel narrative, the traditional Zionist narrative, doesn't really talk about Palestinians at all. It either pretends that Palestinians don't exist. Again, there was this kind of phrase that you heard in the film that many people are told growing up, that the land of Israel was a land for a people without a land, basically saying it was an empty wasteland that was so the Jews could go take it over. Or if it admits that there were Palestinian people living there, it suggests that they were small bands of Arab people that had not settled the land, that were essentially insignificant. And thus it's okay for us to settle that land and take it over. And over the course of this year, my senior year, he gave me all these books by Palestinian historians, including Rashid Khalidi, Edward Said, but actually most importantly for me, left-wing Israeli historians. And it was especially reading left-wing Israeli historians talk about the Nakba, in which 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their homes and never allowed to come home. And obviously the occupation, the system of apartheid military rule that's close to 60 years old at this point, to actually see Jewish people and Israelis talk openly about these phenomenon like they were real things, made me realize that there was an entire part of the story that I was missing. And that also I knew nothing about Palestinian history and needed to learn a lot about this people that, again, the traditional pro-Israel narrative essentially pretends does not exist. So over that course of that year, I read, as much as I could. And when I got to college, I began doing kind of left-wing Jewish organizing around the question of Israel-Palestine, essentially bringing left-wing Israeli voices to campus, bringing Palestinian voices to campus. And it was especially during college that I met so many people who were very much like Simone and Eitan, who went to Jewish day school, had been part of much larger Jewish communities than I had, and had a much more intense pro-Israel education than I had. Again, as you hear in the film, 10% of Simone's high school joined the Israeli military, and I met kids in college, American Jews who had just gotten back from the Israeli military, actually. And I was actually seeing these young Jewish students in college actually come into contact with Palestinian narratives for the first time. Some of them would meet Palestinian students or have classes with Palestinian professors or go to guest lectures by Palestinians. And they had been told that they needed to go to college and defend Israel at all costs. But when they actually heard Palestinian narratives for the first time, they too began to realize, like I began to realize in high school, that there was this massive part of the story that had been withheld from them, that there was this massive part of the story, an entire people's history that had been completely glossed over. And it was profound to see them change. And within a couple of years, almost all the kind of diehard pro-Israel student leaders on my college campus began doing work for Palestinian human rights. Some within the context of kind of the left-wing Israeli world, but almost all of them began doing left-wing human rights work, advocating for Palestinian rights. And it was seeing all of these pro-Israel leaders change in a matter of years once they came into contact with Palestinian narratives that made me realize that my own story of transformation was not unique at all, but was part of this incredibly large generational change happening in the American Jewish community. That's really what made me want to make this film. We began making this film in 2016. It took us 7 years to make. And it debuted in February 2023, about a year and a half ago. And obviously, the film is largely qualitative. It talks about these transformations in a personal sense, but these transformations that we are seeing are massive, and they are incredibly significant. Polling from 2021, so even a couple of years ago, from the Jewish Electoral Institute, a widely regarded polling organ in America, shows that amongst all Jewish Americans, when you ask all Jewish Americans, is Israel an apartheid state? A quarter of all Jewish Americans believe Israel is an apartheid state. In 2021, when that question was posed to young American Jews, Jews under 40, it's about 40%. About 40% of young American Jews think Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. So again, it's been in the honor of my lifetime to get to tell this story that is so closely related to my own personal story, as well as to so many of my friends, and help give a voice to the hundreds of thousands of us who have seen the Palestinian side and realize that we empathize with it tremendously.
It's an extraordinary story. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see who has a question here.
Anything you'd like. I'm not shy.
Let's take questions short so we can get lots of questions and answers in.
Okay, so my question is, the film addresses toward the end this very definitional and existential dilemma that the blind support of Israel is masking the alliance between pro-Israel Jews, that is unconditional pro-Israel Jews, and anti-Semite white supremacists. And we see that happening also in Europe in the recent elections in France, actually, that came to the forefront. So what do you think really at the heart of this, are there no conversations about the fact that we have the strongest supporters of Israel among the Jewish community seem at this moment to be ready to align with the historical anti-Semites just to squash any criticism of the excessive policies of Israel? We're not talking about bringing the question of the existence of Israel into the thing. It's about stopping Israel from committing acts of genocide, from the apartheid, still supporting certain rights for Israel, but it's just to stop Israel from committing this kind of act. What do you think really is happening there?
That's a great question. Yeah, and that phenomenon that we show is very much alive in Europe. In some ways, it started occurring in Europe before it began occurring in the U.S. And we've seen it even in the past few weeks. Right after there was a recent French parliamentary elections, and it was essentially a race between the far right, the National Front group, which is again essentially founded from a fascist party. And it was against essentially the left. And right after the left won that election, a key Israeli leader, Avigdor Lieberman, basically said that all the Jews of France should move to Israel, that the Jews of France were no longer safe because a left-wing government won power. And what was so ironic is that, again, the party that they beat was literally a neo-fascist party, right? It was a party that came out of Vichy France. It's a deeply anti-Semitic, deeply anti-immigrant, deeply anti-Islamophobic party. And this is the party that many Israeli leaders, including Israeli members of parliament, wanted to win. They were much more comfortable with the authoritarian far right, even neo-Nazi-esque party than with a left-wing party. And what's sad is that there has been this kind of allegiance between the pro-Israel right, both in the US as well as in Israel, and right-wing movements across the world, both in Israel, both in the US and in Europe especially. And obviously that's deeply ironic because, again, it was fascist right-wing parties that created the genocide of the Jewish people that we call the Holocaust, and it's right-wing anti-Semitic parties and movements that have been the main threat to Jewish people in the US historically, and across the world historically. Yet a lot of pro-Israel groups don't see those groups as a threat. They view left-wing groups as a threat. And the reason they view left-wing groups as a threat is because left-wing groups, both in the US and across the world, support typically ethnic minority rights. They oppose authoritarianism. And when it comes to Israel-Palestine, they support equal rights for the Palestinian people. And that is unacceptable to Israel. So essentially, Israel has decided to align with groups that historically have been incredibly anti-Semitic, and even in this moment, I would argue, are deeply anti-Semitic. I think the Trumpian Republican Party is anti-Semitic in a variety of ways. I believe many of the conspiracy theories that fuel the Trump Republican Party are based on anti-Semitism, and ultimately, when you kind of chip those conspiracy theories down, they usually get to the Jews are in control of things. That's the kind of ridiculous conspiracy theory that a lot of the conspiracy theories rely on. But the key reason, though, that many of those parties are aligned with Israel is that they actually want our society to be very similar to Israel's society. They support authoritarianism, they support essentially religious ethnostates, and they are fine with persecuting minorities, especially persecuting Muslim minorities. So because of Israel's goals of persecuting the Palestinian people and oppressing the Palestinian people until as much of the land as possible is Israel's, Israel has been willing to ally themselves with parties that support their right-wing policies, even if those right-wing parties ultimately are not in the best interest of Jews' safety worldwide. And we're seeing that, I think, in a crystal clear way. Obviously, the election of Trump in America in 2016 was a huge wake-up moment, I think, for many American Jews. And I think, as I talked about the statistic showing that 25% of all American Jews and 40% of younger American Jews think Israel is an apartheid state. Those numbers and that transformation has especially been prescient and has accelerated dramatically in the past 8 years. And I think Trump actually had a major reason for that. When mainstream, American Jews largely, most American Jews are actually very liberal. We are one of the most liberal ethnic and religious groups. And there's this thing called progressive except for Palestine. There's often this thing within our community where most American Jews are incredibly liberal on most issues except for Palestine. And the reason largely is that we are told Israel is a progressive state. The education many of us receive make it seem like Israel is this wonderful beacon of democracy, where everyone has equal rights and gay people can exist, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we actually learn that Israel is not a progressive democracy, That's what makes us change. And so I think, a huge changing moment for many people, including many of my relatives, was seeing AIPAC, I think it was 18,000 people, give Donald Trump a standing ovation at the AIPAC conference and fully welcome him into the fold. This is someone who, is the most, I think, dangerous, conspiracy theorist in America. Before Donald Trump's election, there was only, from the research I've done, only one public killing of a Jewish person because they were Jewish in all of American history. One lynching or one political murder of a Jewish person. Violence toward Jewish people was essentially not a thing before Donald Trump was elected. After Donald Trump was elected, because of the ways in which he inflamed and reinvigorated white supremacist and neo-Nazi Nazi groups in the US, anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism has become a reality for America's Jews. Obviously, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, in which 11 Jewish people were gunned down by a white supremacist conspiracy theorist, was the best example of that. But there was numerous public murders of Jews in the immediate years after Donald Trump's election. So I think actually for many of us, seeing the allegiance of the pro-Israel right with the neo-fascist Donald Trump was a serious wake-up call to many American Jews, and made many American Jews realize that the pro-Israel groups in America may not actually have our best interests at heart. If pro-Israel groups are endorsing Donald Trump, again, someone who the KKK and white supremacists and neo-Nazis love, maybe there's something wrong here. So I think, again, that alliance between the pro-Israel right in Israel and in the US with far-right groups is very powerful, but I think it also has created more space for American Jews to realize that something is deeply wrong and to fight for progressive values, both in America as well as in Israel-Palestine. Great question.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. With respect to, I appreciate your comments on the far right and the growth worldwide, but especially here. And I'm curious about, AIPAC gives plenty of money to leftist candidates as well, or rather more liberal candidate. And I think that if we think about the idea of an Australian coalition giving this much money, I mean, it's the idea of, it feels like an Ouroboros between the US, right? The US wants to maintain power in the same ways that Israel does in a lot of ways. When you start to pull these threads, it makes sense in some ways that capitalist colonialist societies will start to get terrified and double down. And I'm wondering about, I mean, the AIPAC's impact on liberal politics and how that has moved, and where we see that going, I guess.
Yeah, great question. AIPAC historically has been essentially a bipartisan organization that supported both Democrats and Republicans. Again, as we show in the film, obviously only briefly, we see Obama, giving a glowing speech at an AIPAC conference. If you search for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden AIPAC conference on YouTube, you'll see a million speeches from them. I will say, and again, and AIPAC still endorses many, many Democrats. That being said, and I think part of that is because up until very recently, both of our parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both leadership and bases, both did support Israel pretty unconditionally. What's good is that is changing quite dramatically for the first time. If you ask, polling from, post October 7th, when you ask Republicans, do you empathize with the Palestinians or Israelis more? The Republican Party still overwhelmingly sympathizes with the Israeli people more. Whereas if you ask Democrats, for the first time ever, that I've seen polling, first time ever this year, for the first time, Democrats overwhelmingly empathize with the Palestinian people more than the Israeli people. I think the polling that I saw showed about 50% empathized with the Palestinian people, and it was like about 20-30% empathized with the Israeli people. So an overwhelming plurality / majority for empathy for the Palestinian people as opposed to the Israeli people. But if you'd taken that poll 15 years ago, both parties would have overwhelmingly supported Israel. And so again, it has essentially been a bipartisan issue for most of American history since Israel was created. That is changing very dramatically now. Obviously, I just showed you that polling information showing that, again, overwhelmingly the Democratic Party, in terms of the base, empathizes with the Palestinian people. And although it's taken our leaders far, far, far longer than it should have, and many of the key Democratic leaders, especially Hakeem Jeffries, to a certain extent, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, still, for the most part, unconditionally support Israel. Things are changing even amongst our leadership. You know, last week, Netanyahu gave a speech to Congress, and about half of the House and Senate Democrats didn't participate. About half of the Democratic senators and House members walked out or just didn't go at all in protest. That is huge. The last time Netanyahu spoke, I believe, during Obama's presidency, only about 50 Democrats refused to participate. So there's about a tripling, I think, my numbers might not be exactly correct, of the members of Congress, both in the House and Senate, who are willing to fully reject Netanyahu and understand that Netanyahu is essentially toxic at this point. So there is a big change occurring within the Democratic Party. The next step is to make sure the leadership actually sees that change and recognizes that there will be a strong political cost to them if they continue to support Israel unconditionally. And again, there have been small steps to that. Again, I think Pelosi last week said that Netanyahu's speech, don't quote me exactly, but was the worst speech of any leader in the U.S. Congress in history. And again, Pelosi has been as strong an Israel supporter as you could possibly imagine historically. And again, Netanyahu is not all of Israel. Many people are kind of scapegoating Netanyahu right now, essentially being like, well, Netanyahu's the problem, but Israel itself is great. So just hating on Netanyahu is not everything, but it is something. And Chuck Schumer, even a few months ago, said that Netanyahu should step down from the premiership. These are baby steps, incredibly small steps. But the Republican Party is still 100% unconditionally supportive of Israel. Again, not because they care about Jewish people, because they usually support authoritarian right-wing governments across the world. Israel, again, is very important to the US just from a basic military standpoint. That's a huge reason. And Christian Zionism is a huge part of that too, which we can get into. It's very bizarre. Basically, Christian Zionism is Christians who believe that the Holy Land should be populated by the Jewish people. And they believe that very strongly, usually because they believe in a conspiracy theory that says that if all Jews go there, then the second coming of Christ will occur, and all the Jews will either have to convert to Christianity or go to hell. So not actually very good for the Jews. But again, so I think things are changing amongst the Democratic base and amongst elected Democratic officials. Not enough, but I'm actually not sure I thought things would change this fast. So I am optimistic in the long term. Great question.
Thank you. And I like, Jeff, that we have about 3 more minutes.
That's right.
So we have time for one last question, but I first want to say that I'm so grateful to Easthampton Media, our public television station, for holding both live film showings and broadcasting it in public. It's a tremendous community service. And it's wonderful that they can actually even stream you into us. So thank you, Easthampton Media.
Big time. Thank you so much. One more question, then I mean, I can do 2 more questions. If you guys can stay a couple more minutes, I can do 2 more questions, both those folks, and I can try to answer quickly.
How about if we make short questions and short answers?
Deal. Got you.
You might not want this question. You titled your film Israelism, and it's basically focused around this concept, which I don't recall having heard so much in the past. Where does the word itself come from? And what relationship does it bear to mainstream Zionism? Is it simply a latter-day variant of Zionism, or is this something different?
Great question. Yeah, if you search the word Israelism, or if you searched it a couple of years ago, we didn't create the word Israelism. A number of folks on the right and the left had used the term a little bit. A lot of people had used the term like pro-Israelism, like you need to support Israelism, that kind of thing. But we heard it, and we heard it in an interview. A historian that we were interviewing said pro-Israelism at one point, and we were really trying to figure out a way to, but it was not a mainstream term. It was not widely cited. There's also a couple other movements historically that use the word Israelism, actually unrelated to Israel-Palestine. But we were looking for a title that, in one or two words, really tried to capture this kind of deeply emotional relationship and personal relationship to Israel. And one of the major theses of our film is that for many American Jews, it's actually Israel, not Judaism, that's actually the center of their Jewish identity. And that was the case for me. So in some ways, we use Israelism because it's kind of a play on words. Israel is replacing Judaism as the kind of key center of American Jewish communities, or at least some Jewish communities. It was also kind of a clever play on words. Our film obviously talks about Zionism a lot, but we actually don't really use the word Zionism. We only mention the word Zionism one time in the film. So Israelism is also, it's kind of like American Zionism, right? It's Zionism from afar. It's this kind of obsession with Israel and deep love of Israel without actually knowing very much about Israel. So that's kind of how we came to it. And yeah, I just kind of thought of it one day, but it was because someone had mentioned it in an interview. So although it was used a little bit before, we're kind of trying to coin that term as this, again, talking about the kind of unconditional and deeply emotional bond that many American Jews historically have had with Israel. Great question. And then I think we got one more.
And, well, actually, we can go a little bit longer.
Okay.
Unfortunately, live television being live television, they've been cut off. And I don't know if the recording will be available in its entirety. Yes, it will. But so we can keep going a little bit if you're willing.
Yeah, I can do one. I can do one or two more questions, definitely.
I was raised in a conservative household in the Deep South, and I see so many symmetries in my own indoctrination into the American colonial project that I am seeing in this movie about the Israeli colonial project. And I am thinking about all the unlearning I've done, and I'm thinking about the fact that I wish I had made a movie to show my family what makes sense to me about my own unlearning. And it seems that you've done that. And I wonder if you've shown this movie to your challenging family members and loved ones and what those conversations have been like. And does it move the dial to literally make a movie about something that you feel passionately about?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, one of the major realizations for me growing up was that, again, I'd always learned about Israel again as this beacon of democracy, this incredible place. And again, it's complicated because the Jewish people, did live in the land of Palestine for many hundreds of years. There's a variety of Jewish kingdoms there, so we do have this, historical connection. But at the same time, because we didn't live there for, for only small numbers of us lived there for about 2,000 years because we were colonized and ethnically cleansed by the Romans. The Palestinian experience of Zionism, even though the Jewish people have a historic connection there, their experience of Zionism is very much of colonialism. And many Zionists saw themselves as colonists. That's what's, oftentimes when you call Zionism colonialism, right-wing pro-Israel folk get mad at you. And I'm like, if you read early Zionists, they all call themselves colonists. All of them. They thought it was a good thing. They came from, in 18th, 19th and early 20th century Europe, where colonization was a good and normal thing from the European vantage point. And so growing up, I knew actually quite a bit about American colonialism, but I thought Israel was this incredible, perfect place essentially. And it was actually it was coming to realize that America is actually very similar to Israel, and that how the traditional American narrative talks about Native Americans is very similar to how the traditional pro-Israel narrative talks about Palestinians. That was a big aha moment for me in realizing that, something is not quite right here when it comes to Israel. And when it talks about indoctrination, I think because of the trauma that we Jewish people have been through, the just unbelievable, immense trauma. I think many of us think that, we're special in some kind of way and that we couldn't indoctrinate ourselves or we couldn't, be colonists. And I think hopefully what our film shows is that we're just like everyone else. We can do horrible things like anyone else. We can be oppressed like anyone else, and we can mislead ourselves, just like many other people have done. There's a film called Jesus Camp on kind of Christian indoctrination, and that was actually one of the big inspirations for this film. I wanted to kind of, in some ways, create the Jesus Camp for American Jews about Israel. And the question of can one film change people and stuff like that. I've been very lucky that my family has been very supportive of me. My dad spent time in Israel in the 60s, and we're actually related by marriage to the prime minister who began the occupation, Levi Eshkol. My dad actually spent time with him in the 60s, which I thought was the coolest thing in the world. But when I began talking about the occupation to him and the Nakba to him when I was in high school, he was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He's like, I always knew something was kind of off. And my parents are very progressive and they love me. And when I began talking about this stuff, they believed me. And they've changed along with me. So I've been very fortunate. And it's been much easier for me to make this film because my family has been supportive. That being said, not all my extended family is supportive. My grandparents probably would have disowned me if they were still alive, because they, believed in Israel. They were true believers. But many of the older relatives in my family that 10 years ago would have disowned me, now are really able to engage with me on this, both by watching the film and just by talking about it. I think, again, a lot of it was that Trump-Netanyahu alliance that really scared a lot of kind of mainstream American Jews off. And the question of can one film change people? I mean, yes and no. I mean, I very much believe that pieces of art can change people in fundamental ways. It was actually a novel, a single pro-Israel novel called Exodus by Leon Uris that was made into a movie with Paul Newman. That was that book that really made me a Zionist as a kid. It was really that book and how that book told the story of Israel that made me all in about Israel. And so part of my goal for this film was to kind of do the opposite, was to help create a piece of media that kind of make people realize, again, that Zionism is very similar to American colonialism. It's different in some ways, again, because we have that historical connection and because we were oppressed in horrific ways. The Zionists were both colonists and refugees, whereas most of the early American colonists were just coming there to make more money and steal land, not exclusively. So there's differences, but many similarities as well. And so I do think that pieces of art can change people in fundamental ways. More often, it's going to ask a question to someone and then make that person want to investigate that question. Like one film is not going to totally change someone, but it might make them realize that, maybe I should learn more about the Palestinian people. Maybe I should think more about how we're talking about Israel. So hopefully what we hope to do is kind of start people on a journey or push people further along that journey of education. But some people, especially younger people who, might be very pro-Israel, but really don't know why, their community just kind of told them that they should be pro-Israel. It's been young people who've seen our film that they've been like, holy shit, something is really wrong. And so I think we've been able to change young people in a pretty profound way. I think older folks, hopefully it'll just get them to start questioning things and kind of, again, push them on a journey of education that hopefully, they carry out for many years. So I think we got one more question.
I think that's a really good place to stop.
Great.
But what I would like to ask you is if you'd be willing to continue this conversation on another occasion. I think, first of all, you produced a brilliant film. But second of all, just listening to you is really an education. And I know many of us are in situations where we really could benefit of that. And we can invite our friends and we can participate in an ongoing dialogue that has to happen. Would you be
Sounds
willing
great.
to do that?
Yeah, if the dates work out, I'm going to be traveling a lot the next few months for screenings, but I would love to. And please, if you like the film, please tell your friends about it. Anybody can watch the film on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, YouTube, all the major platforms. It was released about 2 months ago, and we've been a top 10 documentary on Apple TV for almost 2 months now. So people are watching, which is wonderful. But please tell your friends. And if you want to organize a screening like you guys did, it's super easy. You just go to our website and it says click a screening, click to organize a screening. Anybody can do it, super easy. And I'm so grateful.
It was definitely easy. And also this recording, this film and the recording of this conversation will be available on YouTube, I believe, on channel 191 Easthampton Media. So we can also share the conversation with our friends, and I encourage people to do so.
That
Thank
sounds
you
wonderful.
again for producing brilliant and informative and constructive film.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Bye.